In the gilded halls of Windsor, a chilling plan was set in motion, one meant to pull Princess Charlotte far from her home. But Princess Anne saw through the charm, the smiles, the sweet words hiding the trap. What followed would shake the palace and leave Anne in tears the day the trap was sprung. It was supposed to be one of those rare, easy afternoons at Windsor Castle, a family lunch where everyone puts on their best manners and lets the conversation flow over tea and roast lamb. The table was set with polished silver and fine china, sunlight streaming through tall windows. On the surface, it was warm, polite, even friendly. But under the surface, there was tension. The kind you can't quite name, but you feel it in the air. Camilla sat with an air of ease, her pearls perfectly in place, her glass of white wine catching the light. She leaned forward ever so slightly, her tone dripping with syrupy warmth. "I've been thinking," she began, glancing first at William and Catherine before fixing her gaze on Princess Charlotte, "about a golden opportunity for her future." Every head at the table turned towards the little princess. Camilla's voice painted the picture like a postcard, an exclusive overseas school, a place, she said, that would truly shape her into a leader of the future. Her smile didn't waver, but her pauses were deliberate, calculated. She was selling the dream, but something in her eyes told another story. Charlotte shifted in her seat. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her napkin, her usual spark replaced with a sudden quiet. To most at the table, it might have looked like shyness. But Princess Anne, sitting 2 chairs down, noticed everything. The way Charlotte's shoulders stiffened, the way her eyes dropped to her plate, the way she didn't answer when asked if the idea sounded exciting. Anne's eyes moved back to Camilla. She had seen this before, that perfect balance of charm and persuasion, carefully wrapped in the language of what's best for the child. To an outsider, it was harmless. To Anne, it was a move on the chessboard. And the endgame was clear. Get Charlotte away from her parents, away from Britain, away from the people who would teach her royal duty the right way. For a moment, Anne stayed quiet, her fork still in her hand. She watched the room, noticing how Catherine's polite smile didn't quite reach her eyes, how William's jaw tightened just a fraction when Camilla spoke about broadening horizons and gaining independence early. By the time dessert arrived, the polite chatter had returned. But the truth was already locked in Anne's mind. This wasn't an innocent idea. This was a carefully placed trap. And if no one stopped it, it could change Charlotte's life in a way that could never be undone. Anne pushed back her chair at the end of the meal, offering nothing more than a polite, "Lovely lunch." But inside, she was already planning her next move. She had seen too much in her decades inside this family to mistake this for anything other than what it was. And to understand why Anne's instincts were so sharp, why she reacted as if a silent alarm had gone off, you have to know the history. This moment at the lunch table was just the latest play in a much older, much quieter game. Camilla's long game against Catherine's children. For the public, Camilla and Catherine's relationship has always been wrapped in polite smiles and careful small talk. They appear together at events, exchange pleasant words, even share the occasional laugh. But anyone who's been watching closely over the years knows there's more under the surface. It began quietly, almost invisibly, back when Catherine first entered the royal spotlight. She was fresh-faced, eager to learn, and loved by the public from the start. That kind of attention doesn't go unnoticed in royal circles. Camilla, seasoned in the art of navigating palace politics, knew how to keep her own feelings hidden. But her actions, subtle as they were, spoke volumes. Friends close to Catherine say there were moments that stung, a passing remark about her being overprotective of the children, an offer of helpful advice that didn't feel so helpful. Camilla could frame these moments as harmless conversation, but to Catherine, they felt like little cuts. Over time, a pattern emerged. Camilla had a vision for the monarchy, one where her own family held a closer place to the crown. That vision didn't necessarily make room for William and Catherine's children to dominate the spotlight. So the changes came in small ways, an appearance here replaced by another family member. A comment about broadening the children's horizons placed into conversation at just the right time. Anne noticed it too. And to her, the strategy was clear. Create just enough distance between the Wales children and their traditional royal base, so that their public image could be reshaped, not by their parents, but by others. Charlotte, in particular, seemed to draw Camilla's interest. Her grace, her poise, her natural connection with people, these were qualities the public adored. And in the world of royal image-making, that kind of connection is powerful. For someone looking to redirect influence, moving Charlotte out of her parents' direct orbit would be a calculated win. That's why, when the overseas school idea was brought up at Windsor, Anne recognized it instantly. It wasn't about education. It wasn't about independence. It was about control. And for Anne, who had seen similar tactics used against Princess Diana decades earlier, the thought of letting history repeat itself was unbearable. The trap had been set. But Anne wasn't about to let it close. She knew the very next move would decide everything. Anne's protective instinct ignites. The moment lunch at Windsor ended, Princess Anne walked out into the cold courtyard air, her coat pulled tight, her mind already racing. She had spent her entire life guarding the traditions of the monarchy, and she knew when those traditions were under threat. Charlotte was more than a beloved granddaughter to her. In Charlotte, Anne saw echoes of someone she once admired deeply, Princess Diana. There was the same quiet poise, the same quick smile, the same ability to capture a room without trying. But with that gift came vulnerability. And Anne had seen exactly what could happen when palace politics decided to pull someone in a different direction. As she paced the gravel path outside, Anne's memories flashed like lightning. She remembered the late-night calls Diana used to make, her voice tight with worry over decisions being made about William and Harry. She remembered watching from the sidelines as plans were drawn up behind closed doors, plans that often had little to do with the children's happiness and everything to do with power. Anne had learned one thing over the decades: if you don't stop these things early, they snowball. What started as a suggestion could soon be turned into an official plan, dressed up in polite language no one could publicly argue with. She thought of the overseas school Camilla had described. On paper, it would sound prestigious, exciting, progressive. But Anne knew the truth. It would physically remove Charlotte from the heart of her family, from the country where she would one day serve, and from the people who could teach her the meaning of duty. Her protective instincts sharpened. She felt the same surge of resolve she had felt years ago when defending the crown from outside pressure. "Not this time," she murmured to herself, her voice almost a growl. "Not another Diana. Not another child lost to the games of this place." In her mind, she could already see the ripple effect if Charlotte were sent away. Less time in Britain meant less connection to the public. Less connection meant more freedom for others to shape her image, to rewrite her place in the monarchy. And in Anne's eyes, that was exactly what Camilla wanted. That night, Anne sat alone at her writing desk at Gatcombe Park. The fire was low, the clock ticking softly in the corner. She took out her notepad and began outlining the conversation she would have, not with Camilla, not yet, but with William and Catherine. She would tell them exactly what she had seen. She would break down the timing, the tone, the real intent, and she would make sure they understood. This wasn't just about Charlotte's schooling. This was about who holds influence over the next generation of royals. By the time she put her pen down, the decision was made. At dawn, she would go to Kensington Palace. There was no time to waste. The urgent warning to William and Catherine. It was still dark when Anne's car pulled through the gates of Kensington Palace. The streets were empty, a thin mist hanging in the air. She hadn't called ahead. Some conversations are too important to risk over the phone. William and Catherine met her in one of the small sitting rooms, still in casual clothes, mugs of coffee in hand. They knew Anne well enough to read her expression, and it told them this was no casual visit. "Something happened at Windsor," Anne began, her voice low but firm. She recounted everything from the lunch, every word Camilla had spoken, every pause, every glance toward Charlotte. She told them about the way Charlotte had gone quiet, the way the suggestion had been dressed up as an opportunity, but felt like a move. Catherine's face paled as she listened. Her mind went back to her own private talks with William about the importance of keeping the children close, grounded, and connected to the life they would one day represent. "It sounds exactly like what happened to Diana," Catherine finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. William's jaw tightened. He had lived through those years, the endless push and pull over his own upbringing, the tug-of-war between tradition and control. He looked at Anne, his voice firm. "This stops now." Anne nodded. "If you don't shut this down before it grows, it will become official. And once it's official, it will be much harder to reverse." They agreed immediately. No overseas schooling for Charlotte. Not now, not ever, unless it was their decision, not someone else's. And more than that, they agreed to keep a closer eye on what was being suggested for all three of their children, not just Charlotte. "This isn't just about education," William said finally. "This is about who shapes the future of the monarchy." Anne left the palace that morning, knowing her warning had landed exactly as she hoped. William and Catherine would hold the line, and she would stand behind them, as she always had. But even as she drove away, she knew the real fight hadn't even started. Camilla would not take this setback quietly. Echoes of Diana's fight. Anne's car hummed along the wet London streets, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Pulled back to the 1990s, to the days when Princess Diana was fighting her own battles for William and Harry. Back then, the palace was a maze of closed-door decisions, polite meetings that hid real agendas, and power plays disguised as concern for the children. Diana had faced attempts to move her sons in directions that suited the institution more than their own upbringing. She had resisted fiercely, and more than once, she had succeeded. Anne could still remember the day she overheard a conversation in the palace corridors, a plan to send William away for a longer term abroad than originally agreed. The reasoning had sounded noble, but Diana had seen it for what it was, an attempt to loosen her grip as a mother. "Not while I'm breathing," Diana had reportedly told a trusted friend. Those words had stayed with Anne for decades. Now, all these years later, the pattern was frighteningly familiar. The overseas schooling idea for Princess Charlotte had the same shape as those earlier moves, a decision that, on the surface, looked glamorous and progressive, but underneath carried the threat of distance. Distance from her parents. Distance from her country. Distance from the people who truly understood her role. Anne thought about how the late Queen Elizabeth II had, in the end, backed Diana on keeping the boys close. It had been one of the rare times tradition had bent in favor of maternal instinct. Anne had supported it then, quietly, in her own way, and she intended to do the same now. But the thing that chilled her most was how Camilla's tactics mirrored the old ones almost exactly. There was the same warm tone, the same helpful suggestion placed at the right moment, the same ability to make a calculated move look like a selfless act. It was like watching an old chess match play out again. Only this time, the stakes involved a little girl who had inherited her grandmother's charm and her mother's quiet strength. Charlotte wasn't just another royal child. She was a symbol, a bridge between the monarchy's past and its future. Anne knew what the loss of control over that symbol could mean. It could shift public perception. It could change the narrative of the next generation. And it could weaken the influence of William and Catherine in the long run. As she sat in her study that evening, the rain tapping against the windows, Anne whispered to herself, "Diana fought for her sons. Now I'll fight for her granddaughter." The thought gave her steel, because if history had taught her anything, it was this: the palace never changes its game, only the players. And this time, Anne intended to win. Anne and Camilla's face-off. The confrontation happened sooner than anyone expected. Anne was at Clarence's house for a scheduled meeting on a completely different matter. But fate, or perhaps palace corridors being as they are, brought her face-to-face with Camilla in one of the long, narrow hallways. The air was cool, the kind that carries the faint scent of polished wood and old stone. Staff members moved quietly in the background, but when they saw the two women stop, their steps slowed. They knew enough to pay attention. "Camilla," Anne said, her voice even, almost too calm. "We need to talk." Camilla's smile appeared instantly, her tone light. "Of course, Anne. Is this about the school idea? I only mentioned it because I thought it might be in Charlotte's best interest." Anne didn't blink. Her best interest will be decided by her parents, not you, not anyone else. There was a pause, the kind where the silence is almost louder than words. Camilla's smile didn't fade, but it became tighter, her eyes sharpening. "I think you may have misunderstood me," Camilla replied smoothly. "I only want to help prepare her for the future." Anne stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. Charlotte's future is here, in her home, learning from the people who know what that future truly means. If you think I'll let anyone pull her away from that, you are mistaken. Her words landed like stones. The tension was palpable, rippling down the hallway. A member of staff carrying papers glanced between them, their steps slowing, but quickly looked away. Even in a palace where disagreements happened often, this was different. This was two forces meeting head-on. Camilla gave a slight shrug, as if brushing the conversation aside. "Well, I suppose we'll see what William and Catherine decide." Anne's answer was instant. "They've already decided." That was it. No raised voices, no grand gestures, just two sentences that drew the line in the sand. Anne turned and walked away, her boots clicking against the stone floor, leaving Camilla standing in the corridor with that same frozen smile. The moment spread quietly among the staff within hours. By the end of the week, whispers had reached the press. Headlines began to appear about a schooling rift between the royal women. each outlet adding their own spin. But those who had been there knew the truth. Anne had made it clear that if Camilla wanted to play her games, she'd have to get past the one royal who had no fear of a fight. And that wasn't going to happen. Whispers break into headlines. At first, it was just a murmur in the palace corridors, quiet talk between staff who had been close enough to overhear the Anne-Camilla exchange. But in the world of royalty, whispers don't stay whispers for long. By midweek, a short piece appeared in the Daily Mail, hinting at a schooling disagreement between senior royal women. The next morning, the Times picked it up, using careful language but adding one telling detail. The disagreement involved Princess Charlotte. That was all it took. Social media lit up. On X, formerly Twitter, posts praising Princess Anne began to trend. "Anne is the last of the real protectors," one user wrote. Another called her the monarchy's shield. Hashtags like #protect, Charlotte, and Stand with Anne flooded timelines. Behind palace walls, the communications team scrambled. Carefully worded statements were drafted. Phrases like, "Speculation over family matters is unfounded," and "The family remains united in support of Charlotte's future." But the wording was so vague it only fueled the fire. Every new public engagement was now a test. At their next appearance together, Anne and Camilla sat on the same stage, but deliberately far apart. When photographers caught a brief moment of them exchanging only the shortest of polite words, the images went viral. One tabloid headline read, "Glacial Stares at the Palace." The story evolved into something bigger. It wasn't just about schooling anymore. It became a power struggle narrative, a "who really runs the royal family" debate that captivated royal watchers. Some sided with Camilla, believing she was just being forward-thinking. But for the majority, especially those who still held deep affection for Diana's memory, Anne's intervention was heroic. In TV studios, royal commentators couldn't resist drawing the link to Diana's past fights. "It's impossible to ignore the parallels," one analyst said on live broadcast. What Anne is doing now for Charlotte is exactly what Diana tried to do for her sons. Keep them close, keep them grounded, and shield them from unnecessary influence. Inside the palace, the tension was tangible. William and Catherine maintained public composure, but privately, they were keeping their distance from Camilla. Invitations to joint family outings became less frequent. When they did appear together, subtle seating arrangements kept them from close interaction. By the second week of coverage, the media had all but decided the outcome. This was Anne's stand, and she wasn't backing down. And if Camilla wanted to push her opportunity again, she would be doing it in full view of a public that was already suspicious. The whispers had become headlines, and the headlines had become a story the palace could no longer control. But Anne wasn't just thinking about the press. She had her own way of making a point, one that would send a message stronger than any statement. Charlotte's symbolic appearance with Anne. It came as a surprise to everyone, a royal engagement where Princess Charlotte appeared without her parents, walking confidently beside Princess Anne. The event was a celebration of British heritage and female strength, held in a historic London hall draped in Union flags. Cameras flashed as the pair arrived, both dressed in shades of royal blue, a deliberate nod to tradition. Charlotte, at just 9 years old, carried herself with a composure far beyond her years. She smiled warmly at well-wishers, shook hands, and even exchanged a few quiet words with veterans seated in the front row. Every movement was calm, poised, and unmistakably assured. Standing beside her, Anne radiated a different kind of pride, the protective pride of someone who knew exactly what it had taken to keep this moment possible. The event's theme couldn't have been more fitting. Strong women leading by example, staying rooted in the values of the country they serve. Royal reporters quickly caught on. "This is no coincidence," one wrote in the Telegraph. Charlotte's first solo appearance, being alongside Princess Anne, sends a clear signal. Her place is here, in Britain, under the watch of the family's most steadfast guardian. Social media roared again. Clips of Charlotte speaking with guests racked up millions of views. Comments poured in about her grace, her confidence, and how much she reminded people of Princess Diana at the same age. Many noted the quiet but powerful message. This was Charlotte's public defiance of the overseas schooling plan without saying a single word. Even within palace circles, the symbolism wasn't lost. One court insider remarked, "It was like Anne was saying, 'She's ours. She belongs here.'" Camilla, notably, was absent from the event. Her own public appearances over the following weeks were limited, and when she did attend engagements, her family members often appeared beside her. A clear contrast to Charlotte's moment with Anne. For the public, the image was sealed. Anne and Charlotte, side by side, representing the past and the future of the monarchy, untouched by outside agendas. It was a statement without a press release, a headline without a scandal, yet more powerful than any confrontation in the press. And for Anne, it was a quiet victory. Because while the battle might not be over, she had made one thing crystal clear. Charlotte's path would be shaped by her family's values, not by the ambitions of others. Camilla's subtle retaliation. In the weeks after Charlotte's symbolic appearance with Anne, watchers noticed a shift. Camilla began stepping back from events with William and Catherine. On paper, it looked like diary clashes, but insiders knew better. Instead, she was seen more with her own children and grandchildren, at charity events, art galleries, even seated at banquets once reserved for the core royals. Behind closed doors, she told friends she felt hurt and misunderstood, yet made no move to mend the tension. Subtle changes appeared at state dinners, William and Catherine seated further away, Camilla's family closer to the spotlight. Headlines followed. Queen Consort's family on the rise. Camilla's inner circle steps forward. The timing felt too perfect to ignore. Some staff saw it as her reclaiming the narrative. Others as a quiet warning. I have influence too. Anne didn't flinch. She knew palace power is built through small maneuvers. But with public backing for protecting Charlotte, Camilla's countermoves were under scrutiny. The quiet war had begun. Anne's tearful reflection. Weeks later, at Gatcombe Park, Anne finally paused. The fight for Charlotte's schooling was won, for now, but it weighed heavy. Walking through her gardens, she thought of Diana and the promise they'd both felt to shield the next generation from palace machinery. By the fire, tears came as she remembered Charlotte's hands fidgeting at that Windsor lunch, nearly pulled into Camilla's proposal. "Not on my watch," she whispered. Days later, at a family gathering, Charlotte laughed freely with her brothers, no shadow in her eyes.
Anne stayed silent, but inside she knew. She was, and always would be, the monarchy's shield.
The battle for Charlotte's future ended in Anne's quiet victory. But in the palace, wars are never truly over. Camilla's retreat was only temporary, her eyes still on the game. Yet Anne stands ready, the unyielding shield between Charlotte and the crown's hidden traps. This story is far from done.